On a spring evening in 1960, a 25-year-old schoolteacher in South Texas made what appeared to be a routine decision. She borrowed her family's car and drove to Sacred Heart Catholic Church for confession, a weekly ritual she rarely missed. The day before Easter seemed like any other Saturday in McAllen, with families preparing for the holiday and the church welcoming parishioners throughout the evening. But when Irene Garza walked through those church doors, she stepped into a tragedy that would remain unsolved for over half a century. Her disappearance would expose disturbing secrets within trusted institutions, divide a community between faith and suspicion, and ultimately become one of the most persistent cold cases in Texas history. The path to justice would require decades of family determination, the courage of reluctant witnesses, and a complete change in leadership willing to challenge powerful forces that had protected a suspect for generations. Consider subscribing to follow cases where families never stopped fighting for answers, no matter how many years passed or how many obstacles stood in their way. McAllen occupied the southmost tip of Texas in the Rio Grande Valley, a region shaped by its proximity to Mexico and defined by its strong Catholic heritage. The city had grown prosperous through agriculture and cross-border commerce, and by 1960 its population reflected the success of families who had built businesses and raised children in relative safety. Sacred Heart Catholic Church served as the spiritual center for many of these families, a place where weekly mass and regular confession formed the rhythm of community life. Irene Garza represented the best of what McAllen offered to its young people. She had grown up watching her parents build a successful dry cleaning business, their hard work eventually allowing the family to move from the south side of town to a more comfortable neighborhood on the north side. She excelled in school and broke barriers others had not dared to challenge, becoming the first Latina drum majorette at McAllen High School. In 1958, she was crowned Miss All South Texas Sweetheart, a recognition of both her beauty and her poise. She graduated from Pan American College and chose to give back to her community by teaching second grade at an elementary school that served children from struggling families. Those who knew her described a young woman devoted to her students and her faith in equal measure. She attended daily mass and never missed Saturday confession. Her colleagues noticed how she used her own salary to buy school supplies for students whose families could not afford them. She had recently become secretary of the Parent-Teacher Association, a role that pushed her past her natural shyness and gave her new confidence. In a letter written to a friend just weeks before Easter, she described feeling fulfilled in her work and finding comfort in the structure her religious practice provided. Saturday, April 16, 1960, began like countless Saturdays before it. Irene spent time with family and prepared for the Easter celebrations scheduled for the following day. She told her parents that evening she would attend confession at Sacred Heart, the church where the Garza family had worshipped for years. Several parishioners later recalled seeing her arrive that evening, her appearance impossible to miss even in a crowded sanctuary. She wore a white lace veil over her dark hair and moved through the church with the quiet purpose of someone completing a familiar routine. The confession schedule at Sacred Heart operated on a structured system. Multiple priests heard confessions in different areas of the church, and parishioners chose their confessor based on availability and personal preference. That evening, one of the priests was Father John Feit, a 27-year-old visiting cleric who had been assigned to Sacred Heart after completing his seminary training in San Antonio. He had arrived at the church only months earlier and was still establishing himself within the parish community. Witnesses remembered that the confession line moved slowly that evening. Some noticed that Father Feit was absent from the sanctuary several times during the scheduled confession hours. Others saw Irene enter the line and watched as she placed her white lace veil over her head, following the customary practice for women entering the confessional. But no one reported seeing her leave the church. When Irene did not return home that evening, her parents initially thought she might have stayed for the Easter Vigil Mass. The church often held extended services during Holy Week, and Irene's dedication to her faith made such a decision plausible. But as midnight approached and then passed without word from their daughter, concern began to replace assumption. By 3 in the morning, Irene's father drove to the McAllen Police Department to report his daughter missing, an action that would mark the beginning of the largest search operation the Rio Grande Valley had seen to that point. Easter Sunday arrived with families across McAllen preparing for church services and holiday celebrations, but the Garza household faced a growing nightmare. Irene's car remained parked on the street near Sacred Heart Church, exactly where she had left it the previous evening. Police began their initial inquiries, while family members contacted friends and relatives, hoping for any information about where Irene might have gone after confession. The parish held its Easter services as scheduled, but word of the missing schoolteacher spread quickly through the congregation and out into the wider community. McAllen Police Department officers arrived at Sacred Heart to examine Irene's vehicle and interview church staff. The car showed no signs of disturbance, its doors locked and interior undisturbed. Officers questioned priests and parishioners who had been at the church Saturday evening, trying to reconstruct Irene's movements and identify anyone who might have seen her leave. Father John Feit confirmed he had been hearing confessions that evening, though he initially provided vague details about his activities and did not mention Irene specifically. By Monday morning, family members and community volunteers organized search parties to comb through neighborhoods and open areas around the church. Irene's father joined the effort despite his emotional state, driven by the desperate hope that his daughter might be found alive. The search expanded throughout the day as more volunteers arrived, including members of the Hidalgo County Sheriff's Posse, who brought horses to cover larger stretches of rural land surrounding the city. On Monday afternoon, searchers made the first disturbing discovery. A beige high-heeled shoe was found lying in a field along a McAllen road, several hundred yards from the church. The shoe was identified as belonging to Irene, and its isolated location suggested she had not left the area voluntarily. Further down the same road, volunteers found her patent leather handbag discarded in the grass. The purse contained her identification and personal items, eliminating any possibility that she had simply decided to travel somewhere without informing her family. A piece of white lace veil was discovered nearby, torn and dirty from exposure to the elements. The trail of evidence stretched across several hundred yards, each item pointing to violence rather than a voluntary disappearance. Family members who had maintained hope that Irene might have experienced some confusion or temporary crisis now faced the terrible likelihood that something far worse had occurred. The searchers intensified their efforts, knowing that time was working against them. The investigation drew resources from multiple law enforcement agencies as the scope of the search expanded beyond McAllen's immediate capacity. Officers questioned hundreds of people across several Texas cities, casting a wide net that included known sex offenders, family members, co-workers, and former boyfriends. Each interview aimed to eliminate suspects and identify anyone who might have had contact with Irene or noticed something unusual on Saturday evening. The community offered a $2,500 reward for information, a substantial sum that exceeded any previous amount posted for a Rio Grande Valley murder investigation. South Texas businessman supplemented the reward with an additional $10,000, reflecting both the prominence of the Garza family and the community's horror at what appeared to be a violent crime. Tips began flowing into the police department, though most led nowhere. One caller claimed to be Irene, saying she had been kidnapped and taken to a hotel in nearby Hidalgo, but investigators quickly determined the call was a hoax. Another person confessed to killing Irene while drinking heavily, but that too proved to be false, the ramblings of someone seeking attention rather than genuine information. Thursday, April 21st, marked the 5th day since Irene's disappearance. Searchers had covered miles of territory without finding any sign of her beyond the scattered belongings discovered on Monday. Then, a worker checking an irrigation canal several miles from where the other evidence had been found spotted something floating in the water. The body was face down, fully clothed except for shoes and underwear. Officers carefully retrieved the remains and confirmed what the family had already begun to accept: Irene Garza was dead. The medical examiner conducted an autopsy that revealed the full horror of what had happened. Irene showed evidence of blunt force trauma to her head, severe enough to cause hemorrhaging in her brain. She had been sexually assaulted while unconscious, violated during a state when she could not defend herself or call for help. The cause of death was determined to be suffocation, likely from having a cloth or other material placed over her nose and mouth. Her body showed no evidence of strangulation, suggesting the killer had chosen a method that left fewer visible marks. The extended time in the water had washed away potential physical evidence, such as hair, blood, or other biological material that might have identified her attacker. The death certificate documented findings that made the crime even more disturbing. Irene had been attacked, rendered unconscious through head trauma, sexually assaulted while in a coma, and then suffocated. She was dead when placed into the canal, her body dumped like refuse in water that carried it away from wherever the actual murder had occurred. The clinical language of the autopsy could not hide the brutality of what someone had done to a young woman whose only crime was attending confession on a Saturday evening. News of the discovery spread through McAllen with devastating speed. Family members gathered at the Garza home, their worst fears confirmed. Irene's cousin, Linda, only 9 years old at the time, would later recall the sound of screaming that filled the house when the family received official notification. The screams came from her aunt, from her mother, from everyone who had held on to hope even as the days passed without word. The community that had mobilized to search now prepared to mourn, and questions about who could have committed such an act began to focus on the last place Irene was seen alive. Sacred Heart Catholic Church became the focal point of an investigation that would test the boundaries between religious authority and criminal accountability. Detectives returned to the building repeatedly, interviewing staff and examining every room where Irene might have been during her final hours. The physical evidence began pointing in a direction that many in the community found almost impossible to accept. Father John Feit, the young priest who had heard confessions that Saturday evening, emerged as the primary suspect in a crime that seemed incompatible with his role as a man of God. When police drained the canal at the end of April, officers found a critical piece of evidence near where Irene's body had been discovered. A green Kodak slide viewer with a long black cord lay partially buried in the mud and debris. The heavy metallic device appeared out of place in the canal, and investigators immediately recognized its potential significance. They released information about the viewer to the public, asking anyone who might recognize it to come forward with information. 2 days after the public appeal, Father Feit contacted police with a handwritten note. He acknowledged that the slide viewer belonged to him, stating he had purchased it the previous year in a nearby town. The admission placed Feit's personal property at the location where Irene's body was found, a connection that demanded explanation. Feit offered none beyond confirming ownership, leaving investigators to draw their own conclusions about how his possession ended up in a canal alongside a murder victim. The police focus on Feit intensified as inconsistencies emerged in his account of Saturday evening. He initially denied hearing Irene's confession at all, then changed his story to admit he had seen her, but provided conflicting details about where the confession took place. Eventually, Feit acknowledged that he heard Irene's confession in the church rectory rather than in the traditional confessional booths. This admission troubled both investigators and church officials, as hearing confession in the rectory violated standard protocol and represented a highly unusual and inappropriate deviation from normal practice. Feit explained his absence from the sanctuary during confession hours by claiming he had broken his eyeglasses while listening to confessions. He said he often played nervously with his glasses and had accidentally snapped them that evening. According to his account, he drove 5 miles back to the pastoral residence where he lived to retrieve his spare pair. When he arrived at the residence, he claimed he had no key to enter, forcing him to scale the exterior wall to reach a second-floor window. He attributed the visible scratches on his hands to scraping against the brick structure during his climb. Father Joseph O'Brien, a fellow priest at Sacred Heart, noticed those scratches on Feit's hands after the Easter Vigil Mass. The marks appeared consistent with defensive wounds rather than injuries from climbing brick, though O'Brien kept his suspicions private at the time. Other priests reported that Feit had been away from the sanctuary multiple times during the scheduled confession period, absences that aligned with the timeline of Irene's disappearance and the activities Feit later described. Church members who had attended confession that evening told police that Father Feit's line moved slowly compared to other priests hearing confessions. Several parishioners remembered waiting longer than usual, though none reported seeing anything overtly suspicious. The combination of the slow pace, Feit's multiple absences, and the highly irregular decision to hear a young woman's confession in the rectory created a pattern that investigators found deeply troubling. Police administered a polygraph examination to Feit using one of the premier lie detection firms in the country. The results indicated deception, with the examiner noting that Feit appeared to be controlling his breathing during questioning. The examiner's report documented that Feit made unusual statements during the test, including remarks about there not being enough evidence to convict him. These comments suggested consciousness of guilt rather than the innocent cooperation expected from a priest assisting with an investigation into a parishioner's murder. Behind closed doors, investigators grew increasingly convinced they had identified Irene's killer, but proving it presented challenges that went beyond the usual difficulties of building a murder case. The absence of physical evidence linking Feit directly to the crime meant prosecutors would need to rely on circumstantial connections and the troubling pattern of his behavior. The fact that the suspect was a Catholic priest in a deeply Catholic community added layers of complexity that extended far beyond legal considerations. The McAllen community began fracturing along lines of belief and doubt. Some residents found it sacrilegious to even consider that a priest could commit such a brutal crime. Others pointed to the mounting evidence and questioned why Feit's religious position should shield him from the same scrutiny any other suspect would face. Whispers about the young priest spread through neighborhoods and church gatherings, creating tension between those who trusted institutional authority and those who demanded accountability regardless of position. The investigation would soon reveal that Irene Garza was not the first young woman to accuse Father John Feit of violence. What happened 3 weeks before Irene's murder would provide investigators with a pattern of behavior that made their suspicions about the priest far more than mere speculation. The earlier attack would also expose troubling questions about whether church officials had protected Feit when they should have removed him, and whether Irene's death could have been prevented if different decisions had been made. The investigation into Irene Garza's murder took a darker turn when detectives discovered that Father John Feit had been arrested just 24 days before her death. On March 23, 1960, a young woman named Maria America Guerra had gone to Sacred Heart Church in Edinburgh, a town roughly 10 miles from McAllen. She arrived seeking the comfort of prayer in the quiet sanctuary that churches typically provided. What happened instead would establish a pattern of violence that made Feit's connection to Irene's death far more than coincidence. Maria America Guerra noticed a man watching her from a blue and white car parked outside the church. The attention made her uncomfortable, but she proceeded inside and knelt at the communion rail to pray. While she was kneeling with her head bowed, the same man approached from behind and grabbed her. He attempted to place a rag over her mouth, trying to stifle any screams before she could alert others to what was happening. Guerra fought back with desperate strength, managing to break free from her attacker and escape the church. She got a clear look at him during the struggle, noting his dark hair, horn-rimmed glasses, and clothing that resembled what a priest would wear. Guerra reported the attack to police immediately, providing detailed descriptions of both her assailant and his vehicle. She could not confirm definitively that the man was a priest, but his appearance and demeanor strongly suggested clerical status. The attack bore hallmarks of premeditation rather than opportunity, with the attacker bringing materials to subdue his victim and choosing a location where he had legitimate access and authority. The brazenness of attacking a woman inside a church during hours when others might enter at any moment suggested either desperation or confidence that religious authority would provide protection. Weeks passed as police investigated the Edinburgh attack, while Feit continued his duties at Sacred Heart in McAllen. Then Irene Garza disappeared and was found murdered. When investigators connected Feit to Irene's death, they showed Maria America Guerra a police lineup. She immediately identified Father John Feit as the man who had attacked her at the communion rail. The identification transformed Feit from a person of interest into a suspect in 2 violent crimes against young women, both occurring in Catholic churches where he had access and authority. Prosecutors charged Feit with attempted rape in the Guerra attack. The trial began in 1961 with Guerra testifying about her ordeal and identifying Feit as her attacker. Defense attorneys challenged her identification and argued that a respected priest would never commit such an act. The jury heard evidence and testimony but could not reach a unanimous verdict, resulting in a hung jury. Rather than face a second trial with uncertain outcome, Feit accepted a plea agreement. He entered a no-contest plea to the reduced charge of aggravated assault, a misdemeanor that carried significantly less stigma and punishment than the original felony charge. The judge imposed a fine of $500 with no prison time. Feit paid the fine and faced no other legal consequences for attacking Maria America Guerra. Years later, he would claim he did not understand that a no-contest plea would be considered a conviction, suggesting he believed he was merely avoiding prolonged legal proceedings rather than accepting responsibility for assault. The minimal punishment sent a clear message about how seriously the legal system took violence against women when the perpetrator wore a priest's collar. The contrast between the 2 attacks revealed escalation in Feit's behavior. Maria America Guerra survived because she fought back effectively and escaped before her attacker could complete his assault. Irene Garza had no such opportunity. The attack on her occurred in the church rectory where privacy was guaranteed and help was unlikely to arrive. The escalation from attempted assault to murder followed a pattern familiar to those who study violent offenders. Yet the legal system had given Feit only a minor financial penalty after his first known attack. The Garza family learned about the earlier attack and understood immediately what it meant. If Feit had been properly prosecuted for assaulting Maria America Guerra, if he had been removed from access to vulnerable women, Irene would likely still be alive. The $500 fine represented a catastrophic failure of the justice system to protect the public from a dangerous predator. Questions arose about whether church officials knew of the attack before Irene's murder and whether they took any action to limit Feit's access to parishioners. Despite the mounting evidence connecting Feit to Irene's murder, prosecutors never filed charges. The polygraph examination indicating deception, the slide viewer found at the body dump site, the scratches on his hands, the inappropriate location for hearing Irene's confession, and the prior violent attack on another young woman all pointed toward guilt. Yet Feit remained free while the Garza family demanded answers about why the man who killed their daughter would never face trial. The reasons for this prosecutorial failure would not become clear for decades, but suspicions of institutional protection began circulating almost immediately after investigators concluded their work. Father John Feit quietly disappeared from McAllen in the months following Irene Garza's murder. The diocese transferred him to Assumption Abbey, a Trappist monastery in Ava, Missouri, framing the move as part of his continued religious development. The abbot at Assumption Abbey assigned a monk named Dale Tacheny to counsel Feit and evaluate whether he possessed the temperament for monastic life. What the abbot told Tacheny during that assignment would remain hidden for over 4 decades. Tacheny learned from his superior that Feit had killed someone and needed spiritual guidance to determine his path forward. During months of counseling sessions in 1963, Feit described inappropriate actions he attempted toward a young woman after hearing her confession in a church rectory. He admitted to all the crimes he committed against her. Feit explained that he later placed her in a bathtub and covered her face, then left to attend Easter Sunday Masses. When he returned, she was not alive. He left her body near a canal, discarding evidence along a roadside. Tacheny absorbed these admissions while operating under the belief that his role was therapeutic rather than civic. He felt bound by the parameters of counseling within a religious context, though Feit was confessing to murder rather than seeking forgiveness for small sins. The details Feit provided matched the known facts of Irene Garza's death with chilling accuracy, yet Tacheny kept the information contained within the monastery walls. After several months, the abbey determined that Feit was unsuitable for monastic life and sent him elsewhere. Feit moved to Jemez Springs, New Mexico, where the Servants of the Paraclete operated a treatment center for troubled priests. He joined the order as a staff member and eventually worked into a supervisory role at the facility. In a position meant to rehabilitate troubled clergy, Feit made decisions that would have devastating consequences. He cleared Father James Porter for reassignment to another parish, despite Porter's known history of misconduct with children. Porter went on to commit crimes against multiple children before eventually being removed from his position and imprisoned. Father Joseph O'Brien, who had noticed the scratches on Feit's hands after Easter Vigil in 1960, carried his own burden of knowledge. Shortly after Irene's body was found, O'Brien confronted Feit about his involvement. During that confrontation, Feit admitted he had killed Irene. O'Brien shared this information with church officials, but did not report it to police. Instead, he visited Irene's parents and assured them that if the church determined Feit was responsible, he would face punishment far greater than anything secular courts could impose. The institutional response prioritized protecting the church from scandal over pursuing justice for a victim. Feit was moved from location to location within the Catholic system, his violent past known to superiors but never disclosed to law enforcement. The transfer pattern followed a familiar playbook that the church had used with abusive priests for generations, relocating problems rather than addressing them, and valuing institutional reputation over public safety. Feit left the priesthood entirely in the late 1960s. He married, moved to the Phoenix area, and built a conventional life that included 3 children and 17 years of volunteer work at a Society of St. Vincent de Paul food charity. Neighbors and colleagues knew him as a kind, compassionate man dedicated to serving the poor. None of them knew about Irene Garza or Maria America Guerra. The past remained buried while Feit enjoyed family milestones and community respect. The Garza family received no such peace. Irene's father never recovered from his daughter's death, and the department's decision to remove him from the investigation. Noemi Ponce Sigler, Irene's cousin who was 10 years old when the murder occurred, watched her father cry in their kitchen after being ordered to turn in his investigative records. The deputy sheriff felt powerless against forces that seemed determined to protect Feit regardless of evidence. His disillusionment with church authority ran so deep that years later, on his deathbed, he refused to allow a Catholic priest to administer last rites. The institutional response prioritized protecting the church from scandal over pursuing justice for a victim. Feit was moved from location to location within the Catholic system, his violent past known to superiors but never disclosed to law enforcement. The transfer pattern followed a familiar playbook that the church had used with abusive priests for generations, relocating problems rather than addressing them, and valuing institutional reputation over public safety. Feit left the priesthood entirely in the late 1960s. He married, moved to the Phoenix area, and built a conventional life that included 3 children and 17 years of volunteer work at a Society of St. Vincent de Paul food charity. Feit left the priesthood entirely in the late 1960s. He married, moved to the Phoenix area, and built a conventional life that included 3 children and 17 years of volunteer work at a Society of St. Vincent de Paul food charity. Feit left the priesthood entirely in the late 1960s. He married, moved to the Phoenix area, and built a conventional life that included 3 children and 17 years of volunteer work at a Society of St. Vincent de Paul food charity. The year 2002 marked a turning point in a case that had remained frozen for 4 decades. McAllen Police Chief Victor Rodriguez made a decision that would finally crack open the protected silence surrounding Irene Garza's murder. He contacted the Texas Rangers' newly formed cold case unit and asked them to take a fresh look at evidence that local authorities had been unable or unwilling to pursue. Texas Ranger Rudy Jaramillo accepted the assignment, unaware that he was about to receive help from an unexpected source. Jaramillo began by reviewing the original investigation files, studying crime scene photographs and reading witness statements that had gathered dust for years. He ordered DNA testing on the clothes Irene wore when she died, hoping that modern forensic technology might reveal evidence that 1960s investigators could not detect. The tests came back negative. Irene's body had spent too long in the canal water, washing away any biological material that might have identified her killer. Jaramillo faced the same obstacles that had stopped the original investigation, with no physical evidence linking Feit directly to the murder. While Jaramillo worked in Texas, a detective named George Seidler in San Antonio received an unusual phone call. The caller identified himself as a retired monk with information about the suffocation death of a young woman around Easter in the early 1960s. The former monk said a priest named John Feit had confessed to the killing during therapy sessions. Seidler took detailed notes and asked the monk to send a written letter with more specifics. When the letter arrived, it contained remarkable detail about the crime, though it incorrectly identified San Antonio as the location rather than McAllen. Seidler spent months searching San Antonio cold cases for anything matching the description. He reviewed hundreds of files without finding a case that fit the details the monk had provided. The information seemed credible, but pointed to a crime that did not exist in his jurisdiction. Then a Texas Ranger visited Seidler's office and noticed a file labeled Priest Case. The Ranger mentioned that one of his colleagues was working on a similar investigation involving a priest. That colleague was Rudy Jaramillo. The coincidence seemed almost supernatural. Seidler and Jaramillo lived in the same small town of La Vernia, Texas, but had never met. They compared notes and realized that despite the wrong city and uncertain year, the retired monk's account matched the Irene Garza murder in every other detail. Jaramillo felt as though Irene herself was guiding the investigation, bringing him the witness he needed through a series of unlikely connections. He contacted the monk and arranged an interview. Dale Tekeny had spent decades carrying the weight of what he knew. In 1963, he was a monk at Assumption Abbey in Ava, Missouri, serving as a counselor to other members of the Trappist community. His superior, now deceased, told him that a young priest named John Feit had arrived at the monastery after killing a woman. Tekeny was asked to counsel Feit for several months to determine whether he had the temperament to become a monk. During their sessions, Feit described attacking a woman after hearing her confession in a church rectory. According to Tekeny's account, Feit said he assaulted the woman in the rectory and then moved her to the basement where he restrained her. The next day, needing to return to the church for Easter services, Feit transported her to a bathroom and placed a bag over her head. As he prepared to leave, he heard her say she could not breathe. He shut the door and left anyway. When he returned later, she was dead. He then dumped her body near a canal. The details matched the known facts of Irene's murder with chilling precision. Tekeny wrestled with whether his role as a spiritual counselor obligated him to keep Feit's confession secret. At the time, he believed his only responsibility was to evaluate whether Feit could adapt to monastic life. When it became clear that Feit was unsuitable for the monastery, Tekeny said goodbye and sent him away, burying the knowledge as deeply as he could. But in 2001, when an author asked Tekeny about writing a book on his experiences in the priesthood, the buried memories resurfaced. Tekeny realized he should not tell his story to a writer, but to law enforcement. Jaramillo asked Tekeny to call Feit and attempt to get him talking about the murder. The two men had not spoken since 1963. Jaramillo recorded the January 2003 conversation. As Tekeny explained, he could no longer keep silent about what Feit had told him decades earlier. Feit claimed he had no memory of their counseling sessions, saying he was psychologically and emotionally broken during his time at the monastery. He denied killing Irene Garza and insisted he could not remember what he might have said to Tekeny nearly 40 years earlier. But Tekeny was not Jaramillo's only witness. The ranger tracked down Father Joseph O'Brien, who had noticed the scratches on Feit's hands and searched the rectory with another priest on Easter Sunday 1960. O'Brien had appeared on local television in 2000, claiming he knew nothing helpful about the investigation. In private conversations with Jaramillo, he told a completely different story. O'Brien said he suspected Feit immediately and confronted him shortly after Irene's body was found. During that confrontation, according to O'Brien, Feit admitted that he had killed her. O'Brien also told Jaramillo that church officials recognized Feit was dangerous and sent him to the Trappist monastery to remove him from contact with potential victims. The statement suggested institutional knowledge of Feit's guilt and a deliberate decision to protect him from prosecution. Jaramillo believed he finally had enough evidence to arrest Feit. He presented his findings to Hidalgo County District Attorney Irene Garza, confident that justice for Irene Garza was finally within reach. District Attorney Irene Garza listened to Rudy Jaramillo's presentation of evidence and witnesses, but reached a conclusion that devastated everyone working on the investigation. Garza declared the case untriable, arguing that testimony from Dale Tacheny and Father Joseph O'Brien would not hold up in court. He questioned Tacheny's credibility because the monk had been excommunicated temporarily for marrying before officially leaving the priesthood. Garza also claimed that Jaramillo had unintentionally fed Tacheny details about the crime, contaminating his testimony and making it inadmissible. The district attorney raised additional concerns about Father O'Brien's mental state. By the time O'Brien came forward with his account of Feit's confession, he was suffering from a form of dementia that could cause fabrication of memories. Garza argued that a defense attorney would demolish O'Brien's testimony on cross-examination, and some of the conversations between O'Brien and Feit might be protected by priest-penitent privilege. The combination of problems made prosecution impossible in Garza's judgment, despite the pattern of evidence pointing toward Feit's guilt. McAllen Police Chief Victor Rodriguez watched in frustration as the district attorney shut down the investigation that Rodriguez had worked so hard to revive. Rodriguez later described feeling challenged about why the police department even wanted to reopen such an old case. The relationship between law enforcement and the prosecutor's office deteriorated, as investigators recognized that Garza had no intention of pursuing charges, regardless of what evidence they presented. Irene's family faced the same obstruction they had encountered for decades, but now with the added pain of knowing that credible witnesses existed, yet would never be heard by a jury. In March 2004, Garza finally agreed to bring the case before a grand jury after sustained pressure from the Garza family. The announcement brought cautious hope that accountability might finally arrive. But as the grand jury process began, serious concerns emerged about how Garza's office was handling the presentation. Neither John Feit nor the key witnesses Dale Tacheny and Father O'Brien received subpoenas to testify in person. Instead, grand jurors would only hear audio recordings and read transcripts of statements the witnesses had given to investigators. The decision to rely on recordings rather than live testimony removed the impact and credibility that come from witnesses answering questions directly. Tacheny later expressed disbelief that prosecutors would choose a recording over his personal appearance, recognizing that a living witness carries far more weight than a voice on tape. The grand jury deliberated on the limited evidence presented and voted not to indict Feit. Garza told reporters that anyone unhappy with the outcome would have to accept it until voters decided to elect a different district attorney. Father O'Brien died in 2005, taking with him first-hand knowledge of Feit's confession and the church's response. Dale Tacheny aged into his late 80s, becoming the last living witness to what Feit had admitted in the monastery. Time was running out for justice as witnesses died and memories faded. The Garza family continued fighting, but the obstacles seemed insurmountable as long as Irene Garza controlled prosecutorial decisions in Hidalgo County. The 2014 election for district attorney became a referendum on the Garza case. District Court Judge Ricardo Rodriguez campaigned against Garza with a promise to take a fresh look at the evidence and pursue justice for Irene's family. Rodriguez criticized Garza's handling of the 2004 grand jury presentation and suggested that new prosecutors with new perspectives might reach different conclusions about the case's strength. Voters responded by electing Rodriguez, ending Garza's three-decade tenure as district attorney. Rodriguez took office in January 2015 and immediately announced that his office was reopening the investigation. He assigned prosecutors to review every piece of evidence and assess whether advances in legal strategy or new information might overcome the obstacles that had stopped Garza. The announcement brought renewed hope to Irene's family after years of frustration and blocked progress. Noemi Sigler, who had spent 2 decades conducting her own investigation and pushing authorities to act, finally saw movement in a case she had devoted much of her adult life to solving. On February 9, 2016, police arrested John Feit at his home in Scottsdale, Arizona. He was 83 years old and used a walker when he appeared before a judge. Feit seemed bewildered by the arrest, telling the court that the whole situation made no sense, because the crime in question took place in 1960. He initially indicated he would fight extradition to Texas, but later changed his mind and agreed to return voluntarily to face the charges against him. Prosecutors requested a bond of $750,000, while Feit's defense team asked for $100,000, noting that he suffered from stage 3 kidney and bladder cancer. Judge Louise Singletary set bond at $1 million. Feit pled not guilty to murder charges and remained in medical custody at the Hidalgo County Jail as both sides prepared for trial. The case proceeded through multiple status hearings and discovery disputes throughout 2016 and into 2017. Defense attorneys filed a motion for change of venue in April 2017, arguing that Feit could not receive a fair trial in Hidalgo County, given extensive media coverage that portrayed him as guilty. They submitted a 700-page document showing examples of news reports that allegedly condemned Feit and accused the Catholic Church of protecting him for decades. Judge Singletary heard arguments from both sides, but denied the motion in June, ruling that the defense had not proven prejudice in the community that would prevent a fair trial. The trial date was set for September 2017, but delays pushed it back to late November. Dale Tacheny gave a closed deposition in March 2017, preserving his testimony under Texas law, given his age and unique knowledge. The deposition ensured that Tacheny's account would be available even if he did not survive until trial. Jury selection began in mid-November, with the trial scheduled to start on November 28. Nearly 57 years after Irene Garza died, the man long suspected of killing her would finally face judgment. The trial of John Feit began in late November 2017 with a courtroom packed with family members, reporters, and community members who had waited over half a century for accountability. Prosecutors presented the same evidence that had convinced investigators decades earlier, but had never been properly heard by a jury. Dale Tacheny's deposition played for jurors, his voice describing in detail what Feit had confessed during their counseling sessions at the monastery. The testimony carried weight that no recording could match, as Tacheny explained how Feit admitted to attacking Irene after confession, restraining her in the basement, and ultimately suffocating her in a bathroom before dumping her body. The prosecution built their case on the pattern of Feit's behavior, connecting the attack on Maria America Guerra to Irene's murder, and showing escalation from attempted assault to fatal violence. They presented the slide viewer found at the canal, the scratches on Feit's hands, the inappropriate location for hearing confession, and the lies Feit told investigators about his activities that evening. Prosecutor Mike Garza told jurors they were not prosecuting an old man, but an evil predator who had hidden behind his priest's collar while hunting vulnerable women. Defense attorneys argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that memories from witnesses decades after events occurred could not be trusted. They portrayed Feit as an elderly man suffering from serious health conditions who deserved the presumption of innocence despite the community's desire for closure. The defense challenged the reliability of Tacheny's account and suggested that the rush to judgment against a priest reflected bias rather than proof beyond reasonable doubt. On December 7, 2017, the jury returned with their verdict. They found John Feit guilty of murder with malice in the death of Irene Garza. The courtroom erupted in emotion as family members embraced and wept, their decades of advocacy finally validated by 12 citizens who agreed that the evidence proved Feit's guilt. Noemi Sigler felt a weight lift from her spirit, the burden she had carried since beginning her own investigation finally released. She had done what she promised Irene's portrait she would do. The sentencing phase began immediately. Defense attorneys asked for probation, citing Feit's lack of felony convictions in the 57 years since Irene's murder. Prosecutors requested a 57-year sentence, 1 year for each year the family had waited for justice. The jury deliberated and returned on December 8 with their decision. They sentenced John Feit to life in prison, ensuring he would never again walk free. Feit was transferred to the W.J. Estelle unit north of Huntsville, Texas, to begin serving his sentence. He continued to maintain his innocence and filed appeals challenging his conviction. The legal process would continue, but the fundamental question of guilt had been answered. A jury had heard the evidence that prosecutors in 1960 never presented and reached the conclusion that investigators knew decades earlier. On February 12, 2020, John Feit died of natural causes in prison at age 87. He had served just over 2 years of his life sentence, never showing remorse for what he had done to Irene Garza. His death ended any possibility of further appeals, but did not erase his conviction. Noemi Sigler noted that Feit now stood before the ultimate judge, facing accountability that extended beyond any earthly court. The Garza case exposed systemic failures that allowed a dangerous predator to escape consequences for decades. The minimal punishment for attacking Maria America Guerra sent a message that violence against women would not be taken seriously when the perpetrator held religious authority. The decision by church officials to move Feit between assignments rather than report him to law enforcement reflected institutional priorities that valued reputation over public safety. The refusal of District Attorney Irene Garza to prosecute despite credible evidence showed how one person's judgment could obstruct justice for an entire community. But the Garza case also demonstrated the power of persistent advocacy. Irene's family never stopped demanding accountability, never accepted the excuses offered by those who preferred to let the case remain buried. Noemi Sigler spent 20 years collecting evidence and pressing authorities to act, refusing to let Irene's murder become just another forgotten cold case. When new leadership finally took office with the will to pursue justice, the foundation that family members had built made conviction possible. The lesson extends beyond one murder in South Texas. Institutional power requires constant accountability. Victims deserve advocates who will not quit regardless of obstacles or time elapsed. And justice, though delayed by decades, still holds meaning for families who refuse to forget.